your colleague at the Roosevelt Institute, Mike Consul, had made 3 suggestions to consider in terms of concrete policy changes that maybe could address some of the issues that our movement is concerned with. And I believe his were canceling the debt, holding Wall Street accountable, having some criminal prosecutions, and a financial transaction tax. I wondered if you agreed with those, if you would have different priorities, and what you thought about them.
Well, law professor Frank Partnoy and I are just publishing a piece in the New York Review of Books calling for more prosecutions. I think Americans are confused and angry, and they sit around and say, you mean there were so few prosecutions because these people really didn't do anything wrong or violated the law or was unethical? They merely made big, heavy-handed mistakes on which they made a lot of money? Is that what this was about? I think the lack of sufficient prosecution is suggesting that. So I think we need some real clarity there. But I have a rather long list of suggestions, but let me do them in order, okay?
Yes.
First, we have to spend our way out of this recession. So we shouldn't be talking about tax increases yet, and I'm sure Mike agrees with that. We have to spend on what? Well, we have to just spend for the moment. Expanded unemployment insurance, expanded funds to the state and local governments. Spending on infrastructure now would be very useful because it's a double whammy. It builds the foundation of the economy and creates jobs. We should be spending more. We should also have a jobs program. The federal government should simply be hiring people like they did in the Depression, putting money into the economy and creating jobs, plain out hiring people. Once we get the economy back and moving again, because it's basically stalled or almost stalled at the moment. It may not sink, but it's basically stalled. Then we can begin thinking about some other things. One of them is, again, very serious investment in this country, in education, in more infrastructure, in pre-K education, which we have no national institutions for to speak of, in new energy investment. We need a very serious public investment program. I'm talking not about $50 billion, which the president proposed. We're talking more in the order of $500 billion to $1 trillion. Not necessarily all government money. It could be by priming the beginnings of a new bank. That's number one. Number two, we can pay for some of that investment by increasing taxes. We don't after we get the economy going. Should there be a financial transactions tax? Yes, because it has 2 benefits. We raise revenue, and we begin to cut down some of the silly speculation.
And maybe we should explain what a financial transaction tax is.
It would be a little tax every time you trade a commodity, you trade a stock, you trade a dividend back and forth between 2 people. It could be established in different ways, but they would have to pay a little tax, maybe 1/8 of a point, 1/8 of a dollar, maybe even less. But it would begin to slow speculation. Now, it's interesting. A bunch of economists, including some from mainstream economics departments, recently asked for less speculation in food commodities because they're driving commodities prices of food up and down much too much. And food is such a basic need of poor countries. So that's an example. But I also think we have to completely reverse the Bush tax cuts of the early 2000s, not merely reverse them on those who are making $250,000 or more. If we completely reverse them, all this talk and fear about budget deficits over the next 10 years and the rising level of debt as a percentage of GDP, doing that alone would obviate, would cancel out, would do away with all those fears. If we only reversed the Bush tax cuts and went back to the tax rates of the 1990s. Now, that would mean the middle class would be paying slightly more income tax. So what? Let's get the house in order. I, in fact, think another part of this is that the concern with budget deficits and debt as a percentage of GDP is far too great. But finally, I don't even know if this is a finally. Finally, we need the re-regulation we were talking about seriously begins to challenge how Wall Street works. Don't they make monopoly fees on these deals they do? Is there any competition in this, serious competition in this business at all? What are these trading profits? Aren't they based on some questionable manipulative practices and lots of information available to these people? We really haven't gotten to the core of these problems. And the immense number of conflicts of interest in these big banks. It's not, as Simon Johnson says, just because they're big. It's because they're conflicted. They sell products of their customers to the same people or to different people, and they're often conflicts of interest. If you're selling one kind of soda and the other company is selling another kind of soda, they should be or can be separate companies. If we're giving loans to companies and raising money for them and telling people to buy their stock and then trying to buy options in them and commodities based on those options, lots of conflicts of interest. And finally, can I say one more thing? Because I know
Of course.
Perhaps the biggest thing, and you've probably talked about this a lot yourself and certainly thought about it, the public financing of elections in America could be the single biggest reform of all. The reason we have these lobbyists down there, they spent $1.3 billion, by the way, in 2009 and the beginning of 2010, while Dodd-Frank was being written, $1.3 billion. But why did they spend it? The senators and congressmen didn't take it just to have a nice lunch out of these guys. They took it because they would generate campaign contributions. It's very expensive now, especially because of television, to run campaigns in America. These congressmen, rather than doing legislation and reading a couple of reports to learn something, are out there at fundraisers all the time, raising money. But worse than that, of course, it gives power to the very wealthy. If we had public financing of elections, it could restore democracy in one fell swoop in America. Right now, democracy in America is simply stunted, and Occupy Wall Street and OccupyMissoula are filling holes in this democracy, literally institutional holes. There was no voice for so many Americans until this movement came along.
I heard you say something that sounded a lot like a Richard Koo thesis in terms of overhang of debt.
Reinhart Rogoff, Richard Koo calls it balance sheet recession.
Right.
Yeah.
And do you think that debt cancellation or mortgage restructuring
I should have mentioned mortgage relief. I just forgot. There has to be some kind of serious mortgage relief plan. I also think there should be a student loan plan, a student loan relief plan. I wouldn't mind seeing all of you involved with the Occupy various locations start talking about student loan relief in a time when 20-somethings and 30-somethings just can't get jobs and will never catch up, really, on average anyway, with the people who came before them. So I should not have left that out. And that was a big oversight, in my view, on the part of the Obama administration, not only on my part. But there is so much to do in the nation. But Reinhart and whom I think Rogoff looked historically at these recessions caused by financial crises and found that they tended to be longer. Now, there's been some overstatement of the conclusion, maybe by the authors themselves, the conclusions you can really draw from what they found, because a lot of these are coincidences. You don't know which is the cause and which is the effect all the time. It could be those recessions were prolonged because while they were severe, not enough was done to get out of them. They weren't just natural phenomena. But there is a suggestion from history and from our simple analysis of current circumstances when there is so much debt overhanging a country, you can't get consumers and business to spend the way they would in another recession. So you need even more stimulus. Some would argue the opposite. You have to cut debt. I don't see the logic of it at all, but that's economics.
Right. And so there's a demand shortfall, but a lot of the demand's being held back by balance sheet problems, is what you're saying, essentially?
Yeah. I mean, put it, you use the jargon. I'm trying to avoid the jargon.
Yes.
Yeah. But yes, that's true. There is an aggregate demand shortage
Right.
in America, an old Keynesian notion.
Right.
And there is an aggregate demand shortage in the world. One of the interesting problems is when the world is so interconnected by imports and exports, do we have to coordinate fiscal stimulus more so that we're all pumping together? If America pumps alone, a lot of it leaks out to imports, for example. Yet a new wrinkle in the economy. Instead of dealing with all these new wrinkles, so many people now like to make believe they'll just go away if you somehow cut government spending and balance budgets and keep taxes low.
Right. And so because there's these balance sheet problems, debt relief really could, whether it's student loans, the mortgage crisis obviously being at the heart of it. If we reduce those, that would do a lot. I mean, that's essentially what we're doing, and why we're staying in a demand shortfall is because we are working through this debt overhang, just very slowly. Well,
I think, you don't want to oversimplify it too much. It is a major factor in restraining consumption. Mm-hmm. We had a very deep recession and prolonged recession by any standard, however, even without debt. So it would take substantial fiscal stimulus coupled with monetary stimulus to get us out of it. I don't think the Fed alone can do this. I think it has to be coupled with serious increase in direct aggregate demand, which is what the federal government and other nations can do. Meantime, Europe is bogged down in austerity economics in places like England, obviously imposed on Greece, self-imposed by Portugal, and on. And they've had clearly very bad and rather bad results and harsh results for many of those people.